It's no secret that the Hells Angels are an incredibly violent, vicious organization.
Feared worldwide, the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club is notorious for its rebellious spirit and notorious criminal activities. Born in the United States, this brotherhood quickly spread across the globe, leaving a trail of violence and chaos. Within their ranks, some members stood out, not just for their fierce loyalty, but for their plunge into darkness. Join us as we explore the lives of 10 of the most dangerous Hells Angels. Number 10, Russell Taylor, Rusty, Ott. Russell Taylor Rusty. Ott's journey into the world of the Hells Angels was one marked by deep loyalty and dark deeds. Born in 1954, Ott grew up in a world where camaraderie and brotherhood were everything, and it was this environment that eventually led him to become a member of one of the most notorious motorcycle clubs in the world. As a member of the Hells Angels, Ott quickly made a name for himself within the Sonoma County chapter, which was known for its involvement in a wide range of criminal activities. Ott was trusted, respected, and feared within the organization, a man who exemplified the outlaw lifestyle. His involvement in the Hells Angels wasn't just about riding motorcycles. It was about power, control, and, as it turned out, life and death decisions. The downfall of Russell Ott began in 2014, a year that would mark a significant turning point in his life. Joel Silva, a fellow Hells Angels member, had become a problem. His behavior was increasingly erratic, and his drug use was out of control. Silva had started making threats, and in the world of the Hells Angels, such behavior couldn't be ignored. The decision was made that Silva had to go, and Ott was one of the men tasked with carrying out this grim decision. On July 15, 2014, under the guise of friendship, Ott lured Silva to the Fresno clubhouse, a place that should have been a safe haven for him, but this time, it was anything but that. Brian Wayne Wendt, another member, shot Silva in the back of the head. Ott's role in this murder was pivotal. He was the one who Silva trusted, and it was this trust that sealed Silva's fate. After the murder, the club went to great lengths to cover up the crime. Silva's body was taken to a crematory where it was incinerated, leaving little evidence behind. But as is often the case, the truth eventually came out. In 2017, a federal grand jury indicted Ott and several other members of the Hells Angels for their involvement in a wide range of criminal activities, including the murder of Joel Silva. The trial was long and complex, with testimony revealing the brutal and secretive world of the Hells Angels. In 2022, Ott, along with Jonathan John Nelson and Brian Wayne Wendt, was found guilty of murder in aid of racketeering. The evidence against them was overwhelming, and the jury had no difficulty in reaching a verdict. Ott's defense, which claimed he was too intoxicated to be part of the conspiracy, was rejected by the court. Russell Rusty Ott was sentenced to life in prison, a sentence that would ensure he would spend the rest of his days behind bars. The courtroom was a far cry from the open road, and the man who once lived by his own rules found himself at the mercy of the law. Number 9. Adam Lee Hall. Adam Lee Hall's life is a dark and twisted story of violence, loyalty, and betrayal within the notorious Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. A high-ranking member of the Hells Angels in Peru, Massachusetts, Hall's name became synonymous with brutality, particularly after his involvement in a gruesome triple murder case that shocked the region and solidified his position as one of the most dangerous figures within the club. Hall's criminal career began long before the 2011 murders that would eventually lead to his downfall. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, he established himself as a force within the Hells Angels. He was known for his ruthlessness and willingness to go to extreme lengths to protect the club's interests. His reputation was so formidable that even law enforcement found it difficult to penetrate the walls of silence that surrounded his activities. In 2011, Adam Lee Hall's violent tendencies came to a head when he orchestrated the kidnapping and murder of David Glasser. David Glasser was a former associate who planned to testify against Hall in an unrelated assault case. Fearing the potential consequences of Glasser's testimony, Hall decided to eliminate the threat. Along with two accomplices, David Shalhoub and Caius Viovis, Hall kidnapped Glasser, his roommate Edward Frampton, and their friend Robert Chadwell. The three men were brutally murdered, their bodies dismembered with a power saw, and then buried in a remote location. The murders were part of a calculated plan to silence witnesses and maintain Hall's dominance within the Hells Angels. However, the discovery of the bodies 10 days later led to an intense investigation that quickly pointed to Hall and his accomplices. Despite Hall's attempts to manipulate the legal system, including trying to become an FBI informant and sabotaging his defense by discussing his attorney's strategies with the police, he could not escape justice this time. In 2014, Hall was convicted of multiple crimes, including first-degree murder, and was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. His sentence originally included 5 consecutive life terms, but one of the kidnapping convictions was later overturned in 2020, reducing his sentence to 4 life terms. Despite this slight reduction, Hall remains behind bars, with no hope of ever walking free again. Number 8. David Richard. David Richards' life is a haunting chapter in the history of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. Richards, a member of the British chapter of the Hells Angels, became infamous for the murder of 16-year-old Michael Groves in December 1984. The crime was particularly gruesome. Groves was attacked by Richards and his girlfriend in West London with a hammer, a wrench, and a knife, suffering 56 injuries. To further cement the terror, Richards used the boy's blood to scrawl Hells Angels on the wall of the crime scene. This brutal act sent shockwaves across the UK and solidified Richards as one of the most feared members of the club. Richards was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum of 16 years to serve. However, his story took a shocking turn in 2005, when he simply walked out of Sudbury Open Prison in Derbyshire, where he had been serving his sentence. The ease of his escape, and the fact that he remained at large for 9 years, is a glaring example of the failures within the British prison system at that time. The police noticed that he'd escaped and marked it on their system, but didn't do much to actually find him. During his years on the run, Richards lived a relatively normal life. He traveled to Ireland, claimed disability benefits, and even lodged a complaint with the police about misbehaving kids. Astonishingly, he managed to evade capture despite his criminal background and the brutality of his crime. Richards was finally captured in Wolverhampton in 2014 after the police received a tip-off about his whereabouts. He was arrested at a flat where he had been living, ending his nearly decade-long evasion of justice. The ease with which he escaped and lived openly during his years on the run outraged many, particularly the family of Michael Groves, who had suffered for years knowing that Richards was free. His capture, however, did little to ease their pain. Groves' sister, Louise Bull, expressed her frustration and anger, stating that her family had endured a real-life sentence while Richards lived freely. Upon his recapture, Richards was sentenced to an additional 2.5 years in prison for his escape. Number 7. Maurice Boucher. Maurice Mom. Boucher's name is synonymous with terror and violence in the world of organized crime. Born on June 21, 1953, in Kausapskal, Quebec, Boucher rose to infamy as one of the most powerful and feared leaders of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club in Canada. His life is a grim testament to the brutal world of outlaw biker gangs, and his actions left a trail of blood and chaos in Quebec's criminal underworld. Boucher's criminal journey began in the 1980s when he joined the Hells Angels, quickly establishing himself as a force to be reckoned with. By 1987, he had become a fully patched member and soon began to make significant moves within the club. His ambition and ruthless nature led him to form the Hells Angels Nomads chapter in Quebec, a group that would play a central role in the violent Quebec biker war. This bloody conflict, which lasted from 1994 to 2002, saw Boucher pitted against rival biker gangs like the Rock Machine, all in a bid to dominate Quebec's lucrative drug trade. Under Boucher's leadership, the Hells Angels unleashed a wave of terror in Montreal. The Quebec biker war claimed over 160 lives, including those of 9 innocent civilians caught in the crossfire of car bombings and other violent attacks. Boucher's tactics were not just limited to rival bikers. He also targeted the authorities who threatened his criminal empire. In 1997, Boucher ordered the assassination of 2 Quebec prison guards, Pierre Rondeau and Diane Lavigne, in a bid to intimidate the justice system and demonstrate his power. Despite the mayhem he caused, it took the authorities years to bring Boucher to justice. His first trial in 1998 ended in acquittal, but relentless efforts by law enforcement led to a retrial. In 2002, Boucher was finally convicted of multiple crimes, including 2 counts of first-degree murder, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for at least 25 years. Boucher was incarcerated at the Sainte-Anne-de-Plains Penitentiary, one of Canada's most secure facilities. Even behind bars, Boucher's influence lingered. In prison, he attempted to orchestrate an assassination, proving that his thirst for power and control was unquenchable. However, Boucher's reign of terror came to a definitive end when he died of throat cancer on July 10, 2022, at the age of 69, while still serving his sentence. Number 6. Otis Garrett. Otis "Buck" Garrett was a notorious figure within the Hells Angels motorcycle club, particularly known for his brutal and calculated criminal activities. Born in the early 1940s, Garrett quickly rose through the ranks of the Hells Angels in Vallejo, California, becoming one of the club's most feared leaders. His involvement in the club wasn't just limited to the typical activities associated with outlaw motorcycle gangs. Garrett was deeply entrenched in the criminal underworld, dealing in drugs, prostitution, and murder. By the 1970s, Garrett had established himself as a powerful force within the Hells Angels, notorious for his role in the methamphetamine trade. However, his criminal empire began to unravel in the late 1970s when he ordered the execution-style killings of 4 people, including 24-year-old Margot Compton, her twin 6-year-old daughters, and Gary Sessler, the 19-year-old son of Compton's boyfriend. The murders occurred on August 7, 1977, and were carried out because Compton had testified against Garrett in a San Francisco pimping trial. The murders were brutal and cold-blooded, with each victim shot in the head. Garrett ordered the killings to send a message and protect his criminal interests, making it clear that anyone who crossed him would pay the ultimate price. The case remained unsolved for many years, but persistent efforts by law enforcement eventually brought Garrett to justice. In 1995, after a lengthy investigation and trial, Garrett was convicted of the murders and sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms in prison. The conviction came nearly 2 decades after the crime, highlighting the challenges authorities faced in bringing down such a dangerous and well-connected criminal. Number 5. Benjamin Silva. Hell's Angel. Benjamin Silva's life is a chilling tale of violence and crime, culminating in a series of brutal murders that would ultimately lead to his incarceration. Silva's name became infamous in 1981 when he, along with 2 accomplices, Joseph Shelton and Norman Thomas, kidnapped and murdered college students Kevin Thorpe and Laura Craig in Northern California. This heinous crime marked Silva as a dangerous figure within the criminal underworld. Born in the late 1950s, Silva was deeply involved in criminal activities from a young age. By the time of the murders in 1981, he had already established himself as a significant figure in the criminal world, with a reputation for violence. The events leading up to the murders of Thorpe and Craig were particularly gruesome. The couple was abducted while returning to college, and Silva, along with his accomplices, took them to a remote cabin in Lassen County. There, Thorpe was chained to a tree and brutally executed with an automatic weapon before his body was dismembered and buried. Craig was held captive, raped, and eventually shot and killed several days later. Silva's trial was a complex and controversial affair. Initially, he was sentenced to death in 1982 after being convicted of Thorpe's murder. However, due to prosecutorial misconduct, including the withholding of crucial evidence, his death sentence was overturned in 2005 by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Despite this, Silva remained behind bars, as his convictions for kidnapping, robbery, and other related charges were upheld. In 2007, Silva pleaded no contest to the murder charges and was resentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Silva's time in prison has been marked by multiple legal battles and appeals, but his involvement in such a brutal crime has ensured that he remains incarcerated. Number 4. Raymond "Ray" Folks. Raymond "Ray" Folks, known in the biker world as Ray, was once the powerful president of the Sonoma County chapter of the Hells Angels. Born in 1954, Ray grew up in a tough neighborhood where the line between right and wrong was often blurred. From an early age, Folks was drawn to the thrill of rebellion, and by his late teens, he had already begun dabbling in petty crime. It wasn't long before he found himself surrounded by others who shared his appetite for danger. In the 1970s, he became involved with motorcycle clubs, which were known for their lawless lifestyles and tight-knit brotherhoods. By the time Folks reached his 20s, he had fully immersed himself in the biker culture. He was drawn to the sense of belonging and the respect that came with being part of a feared and revered group. This led him to the Hells Angels. By the 1990s, Folks had risen through the ranks and earned his place as a full-fledged member of the Sonoma County chapter. As a Hells Angel, Folks was involved in various criminal activities that went far beyond the rebellious antics of a biker gang. He participated in drug trafficking, extortion, and violent assaults, crimes that were carried out with ruthless efficiency. His reputation for brutality earned him the presidency of the Sonoma chapter, a role that came with both power and the heavy burden of maintaining the gang's fearsome reputation. Folks was not just a leader, he was an enforcer. He was known for his ability to instill fear and command loyalty. His methods were often brutal, and he showed no mercy to those who crossed the Hells Angels or threatened their operations. One of the most infamous incidents tied to Folks occurred in the early 2000s when he led a vicious assault on a fellow member who had been expelled from from the club. The victim was beaten for hours, pistol whipped, and even forcibly tattooed as a mark of disgrace. This was not just a punishment, it was a message to anyone who dared to betray the Brotherhood, but Folks's violent reign couldn't last forever. He was arrested in 2017, along with several other high-ranking members of the Sonoma chapter. The charges against him were severe: racketeering, conspiracy, assault with a deadly weapon, and witness intimidation, among others. The trial that followed was a lengthy and complex affair, with prosecutors painting a damning picture of Folks as a man who had spent decades enforcing the violent code of the Hells Angels. Witnesses testified about the fear and intimidation tactics used by Folks and his associates to maintain control over their criminal empire. The jury found him guilty on all counts, and in 2023, he was sentenced to a lengthy prison term that effectively ended his career as a Hells Angel. Number 3. Jonathan John Nelson. We already know that Jonathan John Nelson was involved in the murder of Joel Silva, a case that shocked many and highlighted the brutal reality of life within the Hells Angels. But Nelson's story didn't begin with this notorious crime. It's a tale that starts much earlier, rooted in the rough streets of Santa Rosa, California, where Nelson grew up. Born in 1974, Jonathan Nelson's early life was marked by a sense of rebellion and a desire to carve out his own path, one that ultimately led him to the Hells Angels. By the time he was in his late teens, Nelson was already drawn to the allure of motorcycles and the freedom they represented. The brotherhood and camaraderie within the biker culture captivated him, and it wasn't long before he started hanging around with local biker groups. These early experiences set the stage for what would become a lifetime commitment to the outlaw lifestyle. In the early 1990s, Nelson's dedication and fearless nature caught the attention of the Hells Angels, the most feared and respected motorcycle club in the world. He quickly rose through the ranks, becoming a full-patch member of the Sonoma County chapter. Nelson's charisma and leadership skills made him a natural leader, and he soon became one of the most influential members of the chapter. As Nelson's power within the Hells Angels grew, so did his involvement in the club's criminal enterprises. The 1990s and 2000s were a period of significant activity for the Hells Angels, and Nelson was at the center of it all. He was deeply involved in drug trafficking, extortion, and violent enforcement of the club's rules. His ability to manage these operations with ruthless efficiency earned him the position of president of the Sonoma County chapter. Nelson's rise to power, however, came with increasing scrutiny from law enforcement. The FBI and local police had been keeping a close eye on the Hells Angels for years, and Nelson's activities did not go unnoticed. By the mid-2010s, the authorities had gathered enough evidence to launch a major crackdown on the Hells Angels, focusing particularly on the Sonoma County chapter and its leadership. In 2017, Nelson, along with several other high-ranking members, was indicted by a federal grand jury. The charges were extensive, ranging from racketeering and drug trafficking to various violent crimes. The indictment was the result of a lengthy investigation that had pieced together years of criminal activity, much of which was directly tied to Nelson's leadership. The trial that followed was one of the most significant cases against the Hells Angels in recent history, exposing the inner workings of the club and the extent of its criminal enterprises. By 2023, Nelson was convicted on multiple counts, including racketeering and conspiracy, and was sentenced to life in prison. His downfall was the result of years of living on the edge, managing a criminal empire that eventually became too big to hide. Number 2. Brian Wayne Wendt. Brian Wayne Wendt is the man who actually pulled the trigger, ending the life of Joel Silva. But Wendt's life and journey to this violent act began long before that fateful day. Born in 1974, Wendt grew up in Tulare, California, a small town that offered little in the way of excitement or opportunity. It wasn't long before Wendt found his way into the world of motorcycles, a world that promised the freedom and thrill that his hometown could not provide. Wendt's early life was shaped by a deep attraction to the biker lifestyle. By the time he was in his early 20s, he had become fully immersed in the culture, hanging out with local motorcycle clubs and quickly gaining a reputation as someone who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. This reputation eventually caught the attention of the Hells Angels. Wendt's toughness and loyalty made him a perfect candidate for the club, and he soon became a full-patch member of the Fresno chapter. As a member of the Hells Angels, Wendt was involved in various criminal activities that went far beyond the rebellious image of the biker lifestyle. The Fresno chapter, like many others, was deeply entrenched in drug trafficking, extortion, and violent crime. Wendt thrived in this environment, rising through the ranks to become the president of the Fresno chapter. His leadership was marked by a ruthless commitment to the club's code of silence and loyalty, a code that demanded absolute obedience and often resulted in brutal enforcement. Wendt's role within the Hells Angels wasn't just about managing the chapter's criminal enterprises, it was also about maintaining the club's fearsome reputation. He was known for his willingness to use violence to keep members in line and to eliminate threats to the club's operations. This reputation for brutality came to a head in 2040 when Wendt was involved in one of the most notorious murders in the club's history. On July 15, 2014, Wendt shot Silva in the back of the head at the Fresno clubhouse, carrying out the orders that had been given to him. The murder of Joel Silva was just one piece of a much larger puzzle that the FBI and other agencies were putting together. In 2017, Wendt was indicted on multiple charges, including racketeering, murder, and conspiracy. The trial that followed was a lengthy and complex affair, with prosecutors presenting a mountain of evidence that tied Wendt and his associates to a wide range of criminal activities. By 2023, Wendt was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Number 1. James Brandas. James Jim Brandas was a name that struck fear into both rivals and law enforcement alike during his time with the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. Brandas wasn't just another member of this notorious group. He was considered one of its top power players, known for his close ties with Sonny Barger, the legendary leader of the Hells Angels. Brandas began his criminal career early, with his activities spanning across the 1960s and 1970s. During this period, he was arrested multiple times for a wide range of crimes, including forgery, conspiracy to commit murder, and other serious offenses. In 1969, Brandas even managed to briefly escape from prison, a daring move that only added to his reputation. The police were certain that he had a hand in at least 4 or 5 murders, but Brandas had a knack for slipping through the cracks of the legal system. One of the most notorious moments in Brandas's career came in 1978 when he visited the Australian chapter of the Hells Angels. By then, his reputation as a hitman had preceded him, and the Australian authorities wasted no time in sending him back to the United States. Brandas's name was feared not just for his brutality, but also for his cunning. 2 law enforcement officials who crossed paths with him found themselves victims of car bombings, a chilling reminder of the lengths to which Brandas would go to maintain his position and intimidate those who stood in his way. Despite his many run-ins with the law, Brandas managed to avoid serious convictions for much of his life. However, his luck began to run out in the 1990s when he was linked to a long-running investigation into a horrific crime. This was the same murders that Otis Garrett was incarcerated for ordering in 1977, the murders of Margot Compton, her 2 young children, and a man named Gary Sessler. The investigation into this crime stretched on for years, but in 1994, new evidence surfaced that tied Brandas to the murders. During the proceedings, a criminal named Victor Carafa testified that Brandas had admitted to being one of the killers. The pressure of the investigation and the looming threat of conviction proved too much for Brandas. Between the first and second trials, Brandas took his own life while in prison. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.